Hi there, I'm Robert Tyminski, and I wanted to speak briefly with you about a theme that occurs in my new book. The book is called Male Alienation at the Crossroads of Identity, Culture, and Cyberspace, and is available now on Amazon and also through the publisher Routledge. One of the things that I use in this book is the idea of apocalypse as a major archetypal explanation of what can happen in the male psyche, in particular when it gets consumed with destructive energies. Apocalypse is a very unusual word that comes from the Greek, and it has a dual meaning. Initially, it meant uncovering or unveiling, as like revealing knowledge. Nowadays, we also think of it as having something to do with destruction and the end of the world, sort of an end of time scenario. This comes to us from the Bible, where both meanings are actually used. And the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelations, which has 22 chapters, St. John of Patmos describes visions that he has about the Last Judgment, essentially an end of time scenario. These visions, interestingly enough, come to him through an angel that speaks to him, and so it's almost like he's dreaming these visions in a way that the angel's voice fills his mind, and he's able to dream about the end of the world and what happens. This is a scenario that's somewhat popular in art and literature around millennial dates. Those millennial dates occur roughly every 500 years. So the year 500, the year 1000, the year 1500, and the year 2000, which isn't that too far back now. A German artist by the name of Albrecht Dürer did a woodcut and printed from it in 1498, so just before one of those millennial dates. And in this woodcut, which I'm going to try and show you and use here, we see that there are 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And these are the 4 horsemen that are described in the Bible. So Dürer used the Bible as an inspiration to talk about, his own interpretation in an artistic way of what this would look like. And there's a series called the Apocalypse series that you can look at online. Many museums have copies of it, including the British Museum in London, which was kind enough to show me actually one of their original copies from 1498 when I was visiting there a few years back. And it was really quite an experience to see and hold the originals of Dürer's prints. So I'll talk briefly about these 4 horsemen and what I think they have to do with the male psyche. So we're going to start over here. You'll see this guy, I'm going to come on up here, has a bow and arrow with him. The 4 horsemen are riding different colored horses, and the fact that their horses have different colors is highly significant. It has a lot of meaning to it. So this guy on who's riding with the bow and arrow is riding a white horse. And now it's interesting to think there are all kinds of ways to interpret the color white, and I'm not going to really discuss that in this short video. But what I will say is that often this particular character is thought of as having to do with conquest. So you might ask yourself, as I have, what could this possibly have to do with the male psyche? And I think that this particular character is something of an archetypal amplification, meaning that it helps us to understand and give meaning to what happens in certain states. And this particular fellow on the white horse, I think, has to do with what happens when there's quite a grandiose inflation that can overtake us, followed by emptiness. This is a cycle with which most of us are somewhat familiar, if anything from our adolescence and young adult years. But for many of us, this can be a lifelong kind of experience. It's not that unusual. But when it becomes extreme, the conquest of the white horse can be particularly troublesome and lead to problems such as addictive behaviors and compulsive behaviors. And this is one way that I talk about this particular rider in my book. The second rider that I'm going to show you is a little challenging for me, but you can see he's carrying a sword, okay? And so this rider is riding a red horse. And again, there are lots of ways to interpret the color, but I think that what we would say about this particular rider and what he might represent for the male psyche is that he is telling us something about pure rage, pure aggression, and the wish to get revenge. Now, this is a feeling that many of us have, so it's not restricted, of course, to the male psyche. Women and girls can have this feeling, of course, as well. But I think what happens and what I talk about is, for certain boys and young men and older men as well, their preoccupation with rage and their inability to process it because of a refusal to explore their inner world and their inner life can lead to very, very serious ramifications in terms of acting out behaviors, such as all kinds of aggression that we might see with gun violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and so on. So I want to give a somewhat harmless example of how this character also shows up in video gaming. I was chatting with a teenage boy that was in my practice a few years back about, I'm just going to say he played League of Legends. That wasn't the game that he was particularly involved in, but many of these games are similar, and many of them actually have apocalyptic scenarios. So in other words, it's either set in a landscape that's about the end of time or close to it, and it's really a fight for survival in that kind of way. And I asked him, I said, what did he get out of playing this game? And could he tell me a little bit about that? And I remember one particular quote. He told me, "When I play, I want to destroy." And I think that's a little bit the idea behind this character with the swordsman on the red horse. That's something about like pure destruction, that when a male feels that and doesn't have an appropriate outlet or a way to metabolize or channel it, really, really terrible things can happen. So the third rider, which I'm going to point to in my somewhat, is over here. And what you're going to see, if I can zoom in a little on this, is that he's carrying scales like you might use in measuring or weighing. And this is also, again, he's riding the black horse. So this is a particularly interesting rider, again, for the reason of being on the black horse. But those scales are often thought about as being used to measure certain kinds of things such as grain, gold, precious metals. So this rider is often thought of as having something to do with famine, when food scarcity is really a very driving issue. So my understanding of this rider and what he means to the male psyche is something about what happens when there are states of extreme hunger and craving. And those are often fueled by a kind of greedy feeling. So sometimes the person in that kind of frame of mind doesn't even know what enough is, and they just want more. And again, this can be very, very problematic if there's a refusal to explore the inner world and the inner life. Now, I'm going to say something about these three riders. What I think they have something in common at an emotional level before turning to the last rider, and then I'll be finishing up. These three riders, I often, in my experience clinically, when I'm talking with boys and men, they often can be associated with a feeling of contempt. contempt is an extremely toxic emotion. We all feel it. It's part of us. It's part of human nature. But when we feel contempt and can't process it again and just want to express it and kind of keep expressing it, it sort of is like acid on relationships. It really dissolves the glue holding us together. And so I think the three first riders on the white horse, the red horse, and the black horse are often associated with feelings of contempt. So when a guy is in a place where, again, he doesn't want to take responsibility and explore what's happening inside himself, contempt is often a way to put it outside and to say, it's not me, it's this thing, this person, this situation that I despise and have no use for. And that's probably a mild, non-vulgar way to express contempt, but you get the gist of what I'm meaning, I think. So the fourth rider, again, I'm going to kind of zoom in here, is all the way over here on, I guess if you're the viewer, this would be your left. I'm a little dyslexic, and having been a lefty who was converted to using my right hand in elementary school. But you can see this guy, and he looks different from the other three riders, right? So the other three riders look like they could be, you know, sort of knights or horsemen. This guy is kind of an older, grisly figure, and he's carrying a trident. Well, he's riding what's called the pale horse. Now, the pale horse is very interesting. Pale would mean like a kind of color that's a little like a yellowish gray. So the reason that color is particular is that's often the color of corpses. And so this rider is thought to be Hades. Hades is associated with that trident, and again I'm going to zoom in here, that the pale rider is carrying. And so Hades and the pale horse would be about death. Sometimes this character in other portrayals is followed by the Grim Reaper carrying his scythe. And so this is really about death. And I think this character is particularly, you know, certainly any of these other riders could be associated with death and lead to situations that are lethal or fatal. But this rider, when he has the upper hand in a person's psyche, that usually occurs in states of despair. And that kind of despair that really doesn't see a future and that doesn't see a place. It's really very dark and kind of, you know, really just about things ending. So this rider I talk about in terms of, you know, boys and men who get into situations where they don't quite understand how dangerous it is, what the risks are, and what could happen to them. And sometimes they get into accidents, sometimes they die, sometimes they kill others. So you could have a mix between, you know, like the red horse, the rage, and then the pale horse being the despair of really inflicting that despair on other people. So anyways, I hope you find some of this of interest. If you want to learn more, again, I hope you might take a look at my book. Thank you.